dance to the music, we say welcome again to Pricking the Bowl. This is Mike the Llama, Dr. Brant Raven.
How are you, Mike?
I'm going all right.
We're dancing to some music, aren't we?
Well, the music's gone now, but we were. I was dancing and not on the ceiling.
So how did we go with our last one?
Well, our last one, I believe, was conspiracy theories. It was all right. We went okay. I don't suppose anyone bothered to look up that Einstein quote. No, that would have been too organised. That's all right. Audio Pete.
Hi. Hello. I think I'm right.
I'm going all right. Welcome back. All right, we're going to...
Actually, it's funny you should mention it because I did look it up.
You did look it up?
I did look up the thing that we mentioned in the last
This is a bit like in the trivia nights where you have a homework question just to see if people will come back the following week.
And the quote, I think, was actually from Einstein. I'm not really... There's some doubt as to...
Maybe it was Dougie Einstein.
Yeah,
a different
maybe.
one. Yeah.
Well, the quote is, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame. I have to disagree.
All right, well, that's all right. He's dead and can't argue back. All right, so this week...
Anyway, yeah, that's not our
that
topic.
is not our
that was
topic.
for our last podcast, which was on conspiracy theories.
It was.
Have you heard that last podcast? Maybe you should go out and check it.
Nicely done. History.
History. Oh, I love history.
I love history too.
One of my most favourite topics. And that's barely English, but anyway.
That's right. English was right down the bottom somewhere. So at school, a lot of people don't like history.
That's right. Yeah, they don't. And
don't like it as a subject.
Yeah.
Is that because it's seemingly not relevant to them?
Potentially. Yeah.
Is that a problem? I think it's a problem.
Is it a problem that they think it isn't relevant? I don't know.
I mean, I know in America history is pretty big. I know you might argue about how well certain people in America might know their history, but given how proud they are of their history and how proud they are of being a nation, the history has a big part in all that. And so they teach it, possibly at the expense of anyone else's history. Do you see that as a problem?
Yes.
Explain.
Do tell. Why do you think that's a problem?
Well, hang on. What are you saying?
Well, if you only know about your own history,
right,
why is that a problem?
Well, it's a problem because your own history does not exist as an island. It is not a history unto itself. It's a contextual thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do not understand your history in the context of other people's histories, well, how can you possibly understand your own history without other people's histories?
All right, so...
take the US take our own nation, for example, take Australia. How can you possibly understand Australian history without knowing something about the history of the UK? And then likewise, how can you understand the history of the UK without understanding the history of Europe?
Yeah.
You know, it's just not possible. I would actually say to you that understanding your nation's history... the teaching of history is difficult anyway, because how do you teach... It's difficult to teach the history of Europe and the history of Australia, for example. There's just too much history.
There's a lot that's happened.
You'd be doing it 8 hours a day. And then how deep do you go in the history, or to what level, to what minutiae do you want to go? But, I would further argue and say, you really can't understand your own history without the context. It's simply not possible.
Okay, so I would say that in America they're very good on their own history. So
you would
certainly.
You?
I would say that. I would say that.
Okay, I would disagree with that.
That's okay.
Yep.
In Australia, though, I would say we've probably been a little bit lacking in that area. So we know about our European history, but we haven't really gone into a lot of the Aboriginal history. Up until now. So there's in recent times, I would say. Certainly, I don't think it was a big thing when I was in school. Back in the late Jurassic, I'm not sure that there was a lot of Aboriginal history that was discussed. Only with respect to European history was it discussed, and even then it was do talk too much about that because it's probably not a terribly pleasant thing. So if we have a shame with respect to our history, should we be embracing that as well? Because a lot of the, we were brought up thinking Captain Cook discovered Australia. That's pretty much the way it was when I was in school.
Sure.
But, a couple of those guys were spearing or shooting Aborigines or Aboriginals.
Oh, no,
But a lot of that stuff wasn't really discussed.
Well,
but
this
now
is
it is.
This is why I balked at your statement where you said a lot of the Americans understand their own history. Well, no, they don't. Very interesting. Let's make a bit of a connection to one of our previous podcasts where you said, for example, what was one of our previous podcasts? We did it a couple of weeks ago. Fallen idols, fallen heroes. Do we watch their movies? Should we listen to their songs?
Yep.
Well, Columbus Day. Should Columbus Day be celebrated? I mean, Columbus was a murdering tyrant. He was, and that's the history.
Like the same sort of thing here. We have Australia Day celebrated on a day that's commemorating the arrival of the first fleets, which a lot of people would argue is actually when an invasion was taking place.
Well, absolutely,
and
it was. But it was. You can't.
Yeah, that's right.
You can't argue that it wasn't.
No.
From the context of the Aboriginal people, the first nation dwellers in Australia, they were invaded.
Yep.
And the acts committed against those people were terrorist acts.
Yep.
Let's not fucking try and sugarcoat it.
No pussyfooting around.
Right? That's what happened. Now, you may want to argue in a lot of different directions and say, okay, I don't want to say that we should have to pay for that.
On Australia Day, when your kid gets a flag and celebrates and says, yay for Australia, are they contributing to that negativity?
It's a tough one. It really is a tough one.
Same with Columbus Day. I mean, I would argue that most people aren't celebrating what happened, but ignorance of your history shouldn't really be an excuse.
I don't have too much of a problem in this day and age with my child going to get a flag on Australia Day and waving it around and being a proud Australian.
Yep.
I don't have too much of a problem with that as long as they understand that the nation was built on the death and massacre and terrorist acts of past, of the Aboriginals,
well, it's probably
and the past explorers.
But that's exactly my point. Is that kind of thing taught in school?
I don't know.
We celebrate Australia Day.
I don't think it is.
Thankfully, it's during school holidays, so it's probably not something that's happening.
I would say that's probably not taught. It's terrible that that's not taught.
All right, let me look at some other areas. So Germans, I would suggest, teach people about Hitler and the war. That's something that would come up. It's probably difficult to avoid.
I would think that I would be surprised if they didn't teach that.
And even if you visit places like Auschwitz, there are, I believe, people telling you the history and telling you what happened.
I think
Germans
it's actually
telling you what happened rather than avoiding it, rather than
I actually think that it's you cannot walk down certain German streets without seeing plaques on the ground or somewhere next to a building or even on a building that says the plaques themselves say, tell a story where this was the house of this particular Jewish family, and it was taken by the Germans.
So you get a bit of a history lesson as you're walking along.
Absolutely. And I haven't had the pleasure of visiting Germany as yet. I went there once, but I didn't spend a lot of time there. So I haven't seen it for myself, but I believe that is the case.
So it's not so much embracing it, but it's acknowledging it and it's having it as part of the history or historical education.
Well, it is embracing it. It's embracing...
That's what I mean. It's embracing it makes it sound like it's it's an awesome thing.
No, it's embracing it as part of the history of that nation.
Yeah.
It's a negative part of the history. It's a gross negative part of the history.
So what about Japan, on the other hand, which does not teach about it and it's a shameful element of their history, which is why people don't know about it. They don't want to discuss it. There's some of the things that happened during the Second World War with Japan, things that they did were appalling.
Well,
but
okay.
they don't discuss it. Don't talk about it.
What can I say to you, Mike the Llama? I, as you know, I've visited Japan several times. Japan is probably my favourite nation that I've ever visited. I absolutely love Japan, and if I could live there, I would live there. Anyone listening? Maybe let me take this opportunity. I'm a very good guest. But no, if they're not teaching that part of their history, it is completely shameful. Completely shameful.
All right, so...
And I would go as far as to say, here's this.
Yes.
I would go as far as to say that any nation like Japan that doesn't have, as part of their education system, a class teaching that negative part of their history, that should come up as a part of trade discussions, where I will not trade with you unless you would put this in place.
Interesting, because you know that in China they've virtually erased the Tiananmen Square massacre from history. You cannot look it up in China. You can't Google it.
Yes.
In fact, we have some people who work with me, and the wife didn't know anything about it.
Yes.
It's saying they had to look it up and watch the videos here in order to
Isn't
know that
that
happened,
amazing?
and they didn't know anything about it.
Although all of them know about, when I say all the young people still know about it.
Isn't that amazing, isn't it? That's amazing. So that's what I'm saying, right? Well, that's exactly my point. I would say when you're dealing with a country like China, you're probably dealing with an unreasonable country, right, compared to a lot of countries.
No offence.
No offence. I'm not trying to offend. I'm just trying to be factual, right? But look, even if I make no assumptions about any country, again, it's what I've said. I would make it as part of a trade deal or some sort of other pact where you are required to teach your nation that these negative events happened or you committed negative things as part
Who
of being
decides that? So
The victor writes the history. Isn't
Yeah,
that the old
well,
maxim?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but we did win the Second World War, and the Japanese, like we're saying, don't.
mention the war.
Yeah.
It's look, it is interesting because wouldn't those people have the same sort of thing back to us? Well, you've treated your Aborigines,
absolutely.
Aboriginals
No.
with
no.
disgracefully over the years. You should be teaching. I mean, we're trying to do it now.
Oh,
but-
absolutely. I'm not suggesting that doesn't apply to Australia. No, we need to lead by example. We need to lead by example, people. We need to say, right, this has happened in Australia. We're going to teach it full and clear. These people committed all these acts, and there's some pretty heinous acts, some pretty amazingly heinous acts. No, we absolutely need to teach that. And we need to run with it in that way.
So that teaching of histories then is actually, could you say it's a form of manipulation?
Oh, yes.
You are certainly manipulating.
Oh, most definitely.
Not just what you say, but how you present it. As much as Audio Pete said, there's a hyphen there. We have to say it, but it's written by the victor, and so. But now I would argue it's because, saying the case of Australia, the Europeans won. They conquered. They came in, but it didn't get rid of the people who they conquered.
How do you? What do I say? I mean, yeah.
Well, again, what about the question they talk about if you denying your history, you're destined, or the mistakes of history, you're destined to repeat it. So could that be said of places like Japan? I mean, they're completely ignoring it. I make no assumption that they don't know about it in the upper, the older people don't remember it, but they're probably not likely to be passing on this information. And so what's to stop that sort of attitude repeating?
Yeah, well, we see comparisons.
And it's the same here, I guess.
When you think about the current administration in the US and their approach to minorities and blaming minorities for things, and there's a lot of similarities being drawn between that attitude and the Nazi regime, which did the same thing. And so, us knowing about how the Nazis worked is really important when we start to evaluate how current politicians are speaking and how minorities can be used as a scapegoat and how that's the foundings of fascism. So we on our guard this time round. We're watching for these things to develop into fascism, and we don't want that to happen.
Look, the teaching of history is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for not only defining the nation and the place of that nation in the world, so it has to be contextual. It's important for understanding what that nation has done wrong, what people have done wrong, and to be able to not repeat those mistakes. Unfortunately, history is not taught, or it's not taught well, and often it's only taught with respect to that nation. I mean, as we say, we're not teaching all the crimes that the early European settlers committed against the Aboriginals. We're not teaching all the crimes that the early European settlers committed against the American Indians, or the very early American Indians, the Peruvian Indians, and all that sort of stuff. There's so many bad things that have been done. It's just absolutely incredible. I mean, we don't teach any of that, and I think that's absolutely disgusting. And again, this is why I'm always reading about this, and in fact, I've got several books on Columbus and how all the bad things that he did. He did some fucking horrible things. Oh, heavens.
But all in the name of progress?
I actually don't think that... I actually don't think the British did as bad things. Right. As bad things as the Spanish and the Portuguese.
You might have a different argument if you're an Aboriginal, maybe, but...
No, I mean, again, I'm not excusing the British. The British did a lot of fucking bad things. But... generally speaking, a lot, the British went in there and basically robbed nations. They were, under the guise of discovery or preservation, they robbed nations. But they would and the way they did it was to development of infrastructure. The railway. The British didn't come in and say, you know what, you need a railway here, and we're just going to give you a railway. That's not what happened. The British came in and said, a railway is a faster way to rob the nation, and therefore we're going to put a railway in place. But in doing so, they left infrastructure. That's what, for example, why India has such amazing and extensive railways. That's
just not enough carriages.
Whereas the British, the Spanish and the Portuguese did none of that. They just basically came in. And I was reading...
Pillaged.
Yeah, they raped and they pillaged. And often under the guise of religion. Now, I don't have my internet-connected device, but there was this thing called the Spanish Requirement, I think it was called, that they used to read to the Indian populations, requiring them to submit. It was really, really interesting. But anyway,
sounds unpleasant.
We've got our top researcher on it as we speak.
Just a bit of fact-checking going on. Now, I would say, I'm thinking back to America again here when I talk about there being a fine line between knowing their history and being beholden to it. So I would say, we've talked about gun rights a lot, and we talk about how that's part of America's history.
Yes.
But they are now beholden to that. You can't do anything about that. It continues, it persists because it's historical. There's no. You need to separate the argument being made from the fact of what it is.
you're talking about, what is it, the Second Amendment? Is it?
Yeah.
Is it the Second
The
Amendment?
right to bear arms.
Is that the Second Amendment
I
or the
believe
first one?
No,
Okay.
Second.
So you're talking about the Second Amendment rights.
Yep.
Second Amendment, as to my historical understanding, exists because there was a historical reason, or there was a context in which it needed to exist.
Yep.
Which was, protection of this great nation from the British Crown.
Yep.
That's why it existed. The reason it is consistently maintained is not because it exists in history. That's just used as an excuse.
But that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. It's not the actual reason, I guess. It's it could persist because of that being an excuse.
The reason that
when you have a nation that's so proud of their history,
yes,
you can't dismiss. They won't dismiss that part of their history because they want to keep it. It's like,
and again, I don't think they need to dismiss part of that history. If we're talking about that particular issue, if guns suddenly vanish from the US, that very and let me tell you, that is actually a very proud thing to. The Second Amendment is actually a very proud thing to have in its historical context. They were, the famous no taxation without representation, right? The American nation was not properly being represented back in England, and so they took up arms. Good on them; they became a nation, right? There's nothing wrong with that level of revolution. Really, I find that quite beautiful and amazing. These people stood up for themselves, and some of the world even came to their aid. France came to their aid for doing that, and that's a wonderful thing. But to look at that in today's context and to say, I'm going to maintain guns because of that historical context, that's really quite ridiculous.
But I don't think anyone... I guess I'm not phrasing it correctly. It's not that people sitting there saying, I'm keeping my gun because we've had it for 200, 300 years, whatever. It's just part of their history.
Yeah, it is part of their history, but it's not...
It's hard to get rid of something like that.
No, but no one's asking to get rid of that. You can't. It's not possible to get rid of it. It is part of their history.
Because it's entrenched in their...
But you can't say, you can't argue, I want to keep my gun because it's part of their history. We need to stop this. It's a fucking stupid argument. You need to... You want to keep your gun because you like your gun. That's it. It's not because it's part of your history. You know what? How about this? Make this part of your history. Getting rid of the gun. That could be a wonderful part of your history as well. How's that? That's a pretty good... Don't you think that's a wonderful part? Imagine.
It's part of our history.
Yeah. But how wonderful. And if a time happens in the future where you need to bring back your gun, then make that part of your history. History changes. You need to learn from the history. At the time, that was the right thing to do. It's no longer the right thing to do.
I have another fine line question for you. So the fine line between celebrating your history,
yes,
and inciting violence. And the example I'll give you, in Northern Ireland, they have marches through towns at certain times of the year to celebrate victories, one side head over the other, that are 400 years old. And the people living in that town were the losers of that battle, and the victors come through and walk through the town celebrating the victory. You're celebrating your history on one side, you're also... you're kind of shit-stirring a little bit on the other. How is that? What's going on there? There's a fine line.
So what's your question?
No, I'm just pointing out the fine line. Another fine line.
Well, no. Let's dig into that a little bit.
Okay.
What's your question? Do you have a question on this?
Well...
Is your question
If I live in a house and 400 years ago someone defeated my ancestors... and they want to keep celebrating, should I be saying, sure, walk on through?
There's fucking dickheads on both sides.
Yeah, I know. I get that.
Right. If you are the ancestor 400 years ago and you feel you need to celebrate that victory,
you're a dickhead.
Well, you're a bit of a fuckwit.
Yeah.
And if you're the guy who's now getting upset about that, then you're also a bit of a fuckwit.
Oh, yeah.
Right? However...
Except that the two things that separate those two groups still exist.
Oh, then that makes it more difficult, right?
Yeah.
And I'm talking from the perspective of a person who's not living in that situation.
Yeah,
so it's very difficult for me to say what's right and wrong. If I were in that situation, I might feel like someone's rubbing my nose in it, and I probably won't like that.
But what if you were on the other side of the marches?
Well, if I was on the other side of the marches,
I might
feel like I'm simply celebrating this as my because I want to celebrate it. But part of me might feel that I'm there to rub your nose in it.
There we go. There's the
right?
fine line.
So yeah. I just think, you know what? Chill out on both sides. Where it's 400 years ago. Chill out on both sides. Maybe recognise the humanity in each other. How about that? How about recognising? How about celebrating
your similarities rather than your differences?
Exactly. How about both of you stop being fuckwits and sit down and have a coffee together? How about that, right? Because
the other thing ain't working.
Yeah, exactly.
400 years. Yeah. It clearly is not working.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, really, if you're sitting down and you're celebrating and if you're feeling like your nose is being rubbed in it, you know what? Take the higher ground and invite that guy over for a coffee. Maybe that's what you should do.
Good luck.
No, really, I'm because living on this earth as I have for my 30 years, right? Living on this earth. As I have for my
dog years, or what are we talking
for
about?
My 30 years. And let me tell you, and having been lucky enough to travel and work and live in different countries, one thing I've really found is how fucking similar we all are. We're all struggling to make a bit of a way in life, and we're all struggling to feed our families and to, love our partners and just to make our way in life. This is why, I think this is why Americans are a bit fucked, actually, because
this feels like an editing out section.
Look, I'm sorry to our US listeners. I don't want to insult you, but you guys need to travel a little bit more to understand the context of the country that you live in, and that will help you understand your own history. It really will. If you travelled, you would really realise you don't have as many enemies as your... did I say enemies or anemones? You don't have...
As long as it's not enemies.
You don't have as many enemies as your politicians are trying, and your business people are trying to tell you that you have. And everyone is similar. Everyone's the same. We're not different, and this is why I love...
You're going to say your neighbour?
I love, the people I work with. I love the people I disagree with. I love gay people, bi people, all the ranges of every other. I would rather love all of these people, and I don't even know what that means. I don't. I obviously don't love them literally, and it's very figurative what I say, but I do. And let me be clear, I don't accept these people. I'm not accepting of them, because if I accept them, I am sort of implying I have a problem with them, and I'm just putting up with them. I'm not putting up with these people. All I'm doing is seeing them as other people.
Yeah.
And they may think differently to me. They obviously have different life experiences. They've grown up different. They have a different chemical makeup.
They have a different history.
They have a different history. And my history is really can only be understood in the context of another person's history, I think. So, yeah, and I will bring up my child loving these people as well. I think it's so important. So for you people out there listening to this that haven't travelled, travel. That's what I would say to you.
Can I give you?
And don't just go to Barbados, as you Yankees like to do.
Can I give you another fine line?
Go on.
The fine line between education and guilt, and I'm thinking what we talked about before with Germany.
Right.
So,
what's your point?
No, I'm trying to examine the fine line. So, they want to educate people on what happened during the war, but is that simply from guilt? They feel an awful lot of people died at their hands because of things that they did.
it's not things that they did. It's things that their ancestors did.
Yeah,
right?
Well, okay, that's fair.
So let's be clear on that.
We are talking history, so the
there may be elements of both. There may
be
elements of both.
Yeah.
This is a case where the means justify the ends. If the education is happening because there are certain political elements that are guilty, that feel the guilt, then so be it. The education is happening. That's the crucial element. I hope it's not happening because of guilt. I hope it's not because of guilt that it's happening. I hope it's through just a very solid desire to educate, to learn, to understand. I hope that's why it's happening. Mm-hmm. But if it is happening because of guilt, I'm not sure I have so much of a problem with that.
All right. My next one. Fine line between denial and shame.
Denial and shame.
This is the Japan one. So it's a case of,
right.
Well, we're denying what's happening, but it's because of our shame for what's happened. So they're such ashamed of what's happened that they pretend it didn't.
Right. What's your question?
My question is, how is that affecting the history that gets taught?
Well, it is. I mean, it's affecting the history that is being taught. Obviously, if a nation is ashamed of what it's done, then it will deny it. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a higher propensity that it will deny, and that comes the same to Australia. Mm. But I would say that a nation, it's up to other nations to bring this out. Perhaps even like a nation like Germany, that probably is very ashamed of what it's done, but is not denying it.
Yeah.
I would say, it's more shameful to deny it. Mm. It's far more
probably
shameful.
Probably not the fine line. It's probably you can feel one way and take the step one direction, which is, as you said, to talk about it.
Yes.
Or pretend it just didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There's far more glory in being able to teach it, learn from it, educate people about it. Mm. There's far more glory in that. There's no shame in that. Yes, there is a shame in what your people may have done, but
that's not
history.
going to change.
But that's exactly. That's going to remain there forever. You're never going to be able to change that. Mm. Denying it is simply more shame. You're not fixing anything by denying it. And I would say that to China as well about Tiananmen Square and some of the other atrocities that have been committed by the Chinese people and against the Chinese people.
I would say the difference with that is that we're talking history, a lot of these things, where that history has stopped and new stuff is happening. Whereas what we're talking about, we can look at what's happening in Hong Kong now. I would say that's a continuation of what's going on, which is why they're not going to talk about it. It's much like we had the conversation the other week about Liam Neeson. He owned up to what had happened in the past,
yes,
and he discussed it and talked about it, not in a way of trying to deflect or get away. He talked about it.
Yes.
If that was at the time, he probably wouldn't have been quite as open to talking about it, which is why it took him 20 years.
Right.
So much like how China is still in the process of what's going on, they don't want to talk about it. But they're pretending it didn't happen. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this whole instability in Hong Kong.
Well, that will be interesting.
Because it's effectively the same sort of thing, but in a more open section of China. It's more open to the rest of the world. It's a big trading area, and I have no idea what's going to go on there.
Yeah, well, but I mean...
But that's still part of current history.
The world has a responsibility when it in helping to write the history of certain countries. Mm-hmm. What's happening in Hong Kong is a wonderful example. The world uses Hong Kong as a lot of, for a lot of trade and a lot of holidays and stuff like that. It's quite easy for the world to say, you know what, we're not travelling there anymore. Until this is resolved in the positive way, we're not travelling. We're not trading. We're not doing this. We're not doing that. You know what? I'm being idealistic. I understand that, right? I understand there are companies...
There's still stuff that has to happen, obviously.
There are companies out there that depend on that trade. Those companies are very profit-driven, and they're not going to sacrifice their profits for a whole bunch of people. And again, I would say to those countries or companies, that's fine. Just be aware that you're putting your profits above the freedom of certain people. Mm-hmm. That's just make that awareness, because that's what's happening.
Yep. And coming back home, a fine line between rewriting history and overcorrecting for the previous history. So
give me an example.
So I think about there's a lot of stuff that's happening now in history that's taught about Australia that is purely focused on the wrongs that were done to the Aboriginal people and how Europeans mistreated them. And some sectors of society complained that we've gone too left, we've gone too whatever it is with our thinking, dismissing the Captain Cook side of things, the First Fleet side of things. You know, it's not an alternate history, but we're letting one fall by the wayside at the expense of talking about one. So that's what I'm saying. There's a fine line between, well, we rewrote it to begin with, but now we're going to go...
Overcompensate.
Yeah, overcompensate is the word I'm looking for. So what's the correct way? What's the right thing to do? I mean, clearly, I would say it's talking about all of it, but the push in schools at the moment seems to be not so much. No, I don't know that Captain Cook gets mentioned. He might have been just some guy that came past, I don't know.
Well, again, I'm a very evidence-based person, as you know, as people who would listen to this podcast know. It comes down to the evidence. You present whatever the evidence is. Captain Cook did come out here. You know, and that history on its own is interesting and wonderful.
I think it's more that we used to celebrate the fact that Captain Cook came out here, whereas now it would be more a case of, well, Captain Cook came out here and he was responsible for this and that and the other. He was part of the problem for Aboriginal people.
I don't think he actually was, though, was he?
Well, I don't know.
Well, they shot the first two Aboriginals that they...
That's a problem.
In Botany Bay.
That's certainly a problem.
That's a very famous first contact.
Was that Cook?
Yeah, that was his first with Banks in Botany Bay. When they first came in and landed in the bay, there were two Aboriginal people on the shore that were telling them to fuck off. See, I've said the F word. and they shot at him. I think they hit one of them in the foot. And
that's not happy to see you.
Yeah, that's a first contact story.
Right.
So it wasn't amicable.
They weren't turning up with flowers and chocolates. Let's put it that way. So that part is. I'm pretty sure that was never discussed when I learned. I was taught that in school.
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever knew that either.
So I would say that would be significant in
there is a plaque there. There's a little thing there to tell it.
This is the place where Captain Cook and his mates shot the first couple of Aborigines. Great, fantastic.
No, look, it's and again, it is interesting. But I think I think it's interesting to know these things. It's important to teach these things. But I think what should be taught most. I mean, we're focusing on the particular events and the teaching of those events based on evidence. That's what we're really focusing about, right? But as I've said on probably every podcast we've done, what we should be teaching is that learning doesn't stop. We should be teaching about and encouraging our kids and our learners to go out and find out for themselves. Read good books. Be critical in their thinking. Be logical in their assessments.
It is very tricky with history, though, because as we established at the start of this particular podcast, kids are a little resistant to history, learning about history. They're not. That's not their favourite topic.
But is that because of the kids themselves, or is it the way it's taught? What is that?
I mean, when I was teaching, we'd always start with their own history to get them kids to tell
yes.
And if you start with their own history and they're interested in their families.
But
you set a project.
You've linked it. I guess.
Pete, what did you teach, Pete?
I was a primary school teacher for.
I thought it was music.
Yeah, and then I went to I specialised in music after that.
Okay.
But the method was with all teaching, especially with little kids, is to begin with where they are and then expand their horizons.
Yeah, that's good though.
Yeah. I think they still use that methodology, that direction. Right, but again, we should be encouraging them, and you can't encourage. You encourage them from prep. You have to really encourage them from prep. But as you get older and older, you need to be teaching that people should be reading more.
You become more self-focused as you get older. You become more limited in what you're actually open to as far as new ideas. And I think that's actually...
Yeah, but you don't need to be like that.
No, but I think that's
relevant.
relevant.
You need to be like
That's
that.
relevant with our current crop of politicians who complain about, the lefty teaching of history. They're not open to looking at that stuff. They've been taught the older way of the older version of our history. So when someone comes along and suddenly says, well, this stuff happened, they take it personally because that's their history. That they are copying it. They're saying, well, this history, and they're like, you're insulting me at the same time. That's part of my history. That's why people take things very personally.
Yeah, I understand why, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. I mean, I understand why that might happen, but again, I cannot get away from the idea that even though we must teach history in the factual sense that it is, even though we've got to teach it in the factual sense that it is, we need to teach the willingness to do self-investigation. We need to teach the willingness and the idea that that people should never stop reading, never stop learning, never stop understanding. That applies to every subject in life. It applies to literature, it applies to maths and the sciences, and it applies to history. I don't need to be a scientist to pick up a magazine, a reputable magazine, and read about science. I don't need to be a writer or an aficionado to pick up something from Bronte and read some literature, to pick up some Shakespeare and read that, right? And if I'm not into that, pick up whatever you're into. Pick up a fantasy novel. Pick up a science fiction novel. Pick up a, dare I say, a history novel. There's a lot of really good, I'm into Roman history as well. Really, really into Rome, into ancient Rome, really into Rome. So I read, detective mysteries which are based in ancient Rome, right? And that because it's based and written in that context, you will pick up various things about various emperors, and
so there's a historical thing as well as being entertained.
Well, that's absolutely right. Now, I would rather people read a book, a historical book on ancient Rome, but if that's not going to...
Maybe this is how it needs to be taught. There needs to be more entertainment.
But that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, Mike the Llama. I'm saying that if you're not willing to pick up a book on ancient Rome and read that book, and I know not everyone is me. They're not interested in reading a book on ancient Rome.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness for that, right?
Yes.
Not everyone is me. But if you're not willing to do that, read a book. Read any book. Read your newspaper. Read a magazine. Read.
But Rome if you want to. Sorry.
Very good. It's a bit of a song reference there. Yes,
I'm just saying, right? This is what I'm saying. It doesn't take... There's not a great deal of skill involved in educating yourself, and history is one area which is interesting, right, where you could educate yourself. And further to the point, there's a lot of really half-decent documentaries which you can actually watch and learn from. There's also a lot of shitty documentaries, right?
Yes. The horrible history.
That's exactly what I was going to say. There's a good series, and it's books as well.
I've got
it's full of murders and massacres.
I've got a lot of those books on the shelf.
Yeah.
The horrible histories, horrible Rome, horrible Greece. I've got horrible science books. They're all there. I've got a lot of them. So.
Horrible reflux. It's all right. Just something I ate. All right. Look, I think we should probably end this. Thank you very much.
I would say we should wrap it up with a joke, but that's just not.
That's what I did.
No,
you did. Yeah. I'm not sure I did. Yeah. Anyway, all right. Look, history's good, and it's not because it's good, but it's often bad. But it's certainly worth knowing.
I would say to people, if you don't know your own personal history, if you don't know the history of your country and the context of the history of your country in relation to the world, then you're a bit of a fool. I think you should. No, I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm simply saying become less of a fool. Go get a book. Go this week. Start reading about the history of your country. Pick up a book about another country and read about the history of that country. How did America get its name? That's a wonderful story, right? You could start reading there. How did a country get its name? You'll learn so much. Pick up a book on ancient Rome and one of the, Caesar or something, and Caesar's conquests in England. Wonderful, wonderful history, and how Germany became a nation. That's a really interesting history. And that sets in ancient Rome with the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right? How do I know that? Do I know that because I'm smarter than the people in the room, or smarter than you?
He read a book.
I read a book. I read the history because I was interested.
I quite like the history of languages.
Oh,
and so
very
that's a good way of finding
That's right.
out
You don't
history
need,
of
exactly.
places,
How wonderful is that? You don't need to even look at a nation. Look at some of the words you use. Where did this word come from? Where did that word come from? Really, really, really interesting stuff. History of language is wonderful, wonderful stories. But again, if you haven't done it, pick up a book this week and do it. But only do that after you've
subscribed,
commented, and subscribed.
Thank you, everyone. We will see you for the next podcast. Thank you, Dr. Raven.
Thank you, Mike Llama. Thank you, Audio Pete.
We'll see you next week.